somehow call roads racist as well. You went over, and these are just heartbreaking stories about I-45, Houston's Fifth Ward. At one point in your book, you said families were given 6 months to find housing. It was 1959, almost a decade before, that's important, the Fair Housing Act would open up neighborhoods to non-white families. You also went with, you mentioned Eric Avila, who's a professor at UCLA, who claimed between 1956 and 66, highway construction would crush 37,000 plus units of housing each year. The Department of Transportation would estimate more than 1 million people were forced from their homes. City planners labeled them slums. No way of fighting back. By 1965, the Voting Rights Act, of course, most urban highways were planned and built. This was devastating to hear the stories from not just the Fifth Ward, but there were many others as well. But it's not even just homes. It was homes, yes, which is devastating, but it was the livelihood of people and where they went and how they just took in life. So as you were researching this, was there, and obviously you talked to a ton of people as well, daycares, etc. Was there one story that just stuck out to you in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, historically speaking, I think the one that resonated most with me was in Houston's Fifth Ward. The Interstate 10, it's this historically Black community settled by freed slaves, and Interstate 10 tore right through the middle of that community in the late 1950s and took out two city blocks, right in the heart of a community where everybody walked, everybody knew each other. There was, schools that all the kids went to. It was a very complete community that everything was there that they needed. And I talked to this one woman who was in middle school. Her name's Oneri Goodry, when the highway came through. And she was sort of too young to understand what was really happening, but she remembers coming home from school and seeing her parents incredibly upset because they had just gotten a letter in the mail from the Texas Highway Department saying, "Hey, we need the land that your house is on." And she recalls, she and her ex-husband, I talked to both of them, recalled, how quickly the neighborhood around them just transformed. They would go to school and then a house would be gone on their block, that it was like moved somewhere else or was demolished. These giant soaring trees that shaded the neighborhood, overnight they would be felled. I talked to this one woman who lived near Oneri who said in the middle of the night she woke up and there was like a house sort of floating down her street and she had no idea where it had come from and then ended up in her backyard.
Mm.
And I just think that speaks to the fact that these Black communities were not given agency or participation in any of these projects. Highways happened to Black communities. They very much harmed them, but people had no idea what was happening, even as they had to leave their homes. Communities were uprooted. And the thing that really stuck with me is that Oneri really wanted to, this first woman I spoke of, she really wanted to graduate from Phyllis Wheatley High School, which is a very prominent Black high school in Houston. And her family had moved, I think, something like 3 miles away from the high school. And so she and a sort of gang of kids who had also moved to this displaced neighborhood called Kashmir Gardens walked every day back to school. So they walked 7 miles
Oh
round
my
trip
gosh.
school and back because they were so determined to stay connected to the community that they had grown up on, despite that highway just absolutely ripping it in half.
What really gets me as well was Ms. Anna Herndon, who would tell the Dallas Express, a Black-owned newspaper, every time and she uses the N-word, which was also a name for the old baseball leagues, gets a place that is decent, the white man finds some use for it. 1,300 plus homes were demolished for the South Central Expressway. What I think would be really beneficial is to understand and maybe for you to explain why they had no agency and why did Texas do this not just willingly, but being able to destroy people's lives legally.
Yeah, it's worth saying at the outset, it was not just Texas that did this. Every single state in the union did this.
Yes.
But this is so I think we have to go back to late 1930s and the Homeowners Loan Corporation that redlined a lot of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods across the US because they simply deemed that, families of color were less creditworthy, that were a less reliable loan for as the federal government was backing mortgages. So HOLC appraisers, redlined neighborhoods across the U.S., including Houston's Fifth Ward. And so a lot of these Black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods were denied access to credit, and they became sort of impoverished as a result of lending decisions made by the federal government. 2 decades later, the federal government passes the Interstate Highway Act, and suddenly states have tons of money to build interstate highways. And there was a very, explicit realization that that money could solve two problems at once, which is to get rid of the quote unquote local in town, which is a direct quote from one of the directors of a highway program,
Insane.
and to build these highways. So, they wanted to, this is the era of urban renewal. We want to get rid of quote unquote blight. So we're going to go ahead and come through these neighborhoods that we don't want to exist anyway. And we're going to, hey, we have all this money to build highways. Like what an opportunity for us to do both goals at once. And so that is very much written in the historic record that planners saw an opportunity to use federal highway funding to get rid of these blighted neighborhoods. That was government policy. I found a report that was a few years old. A researcher today looked at red line neighborhoods and found that they were 3 times as likely to have a highway routed through them as the best rated neighborhoods. So, this is the legacy of discrimination by the federal government, documented by lots of other journalists and historians. But what the federal highway program did is just made that, there was money to clear these neighborhoods. And so people did not have the ability to resist. Again, the Voting Rights Act had not passed. People could not vote these representatives out of office. And so, they just were told. They were told what was happening.
You also told the story about Elm Street, which was the heart of downtown, known as Deep Ellum. And you give some numbers that also really stuck out to me. By 1965, the block had begun to empty out. By 75, the year after the highway opened, addresses on that block of Elm Street were listed as vacant. The highway consumed a total of 54 city blocks. What was this, if you could paint the picture for the audience, what was this area like before it was just completely decimated by a highway?
Yeah, so this is a neighborhood to the east of downtown Dallas. It's called Deep Ellum, and it was kind of a business district. It was very integrated. It was one of the only places in Dallas that were integrated, that Black people and immigrants and white people all kind of mixed together. There were lots of businesses. It wasn't very residential. It was a business district, but it was very, a thriving, populated area. Everybody walked to do their commerce. I talked to a couple of business owners who remember it just being this as close to New York as you were going to get in downtown Dallas, just people on the streets. And you can see there's lots of great photos in the historic archives of what that looked like. You can see people walking down the street in these businesses, these tea rooms, parlors, repair shops, you name it. And in the late 1950s, the Texas Department of Transportation and then the Texas Highway Department decided to build a highway right through the middle of that neighborhood. And really took out, like I document on one, I can't actually remember the number in the book, but on one city block, it was dozens of businesses. And it was wild as just a journalist to go through old city directories, and you can just see them disappear off the pages. You can just see decade to decade to decade, every 5 years as they publish a new city directory, how much was lost in this one district of Dallas for this highway.